May God's love fill this space and these words. Amen. Good morning. I have to say this, that, Brian and I used to attend a church on Cape Cod that had this little felt ornament on the wall. And this time of year, we saw the dial move to ordinary times. And let me tell you, today's lessons, not so ordinary. Whoa. Imagine, and I know it's not that hard, because we've all been there. That moment when you felt like an outcast, when you were alone, terrified, left with nothing more than your thoughts, your inner whisper, and your hope. The image of Hagar, banished to the reeds, afraid to look at her son for being nothing more or less than herself, is shocking. It's unsettling. And yes, it's a story that plays out in today's modern world more than we'd like to admit. People banished out of circumstance. People placed out of fear. People untrusted out of preconceived notions. Outcast by God's love. God's will. Maybe both. A dandelion in a field of beautiful green grass. You are that dandelion. I vividly remember running in my house when I was about 5 years old and wetting a paper towel, carefully wringing it out because I didn't want to get water all over everything, and then leaping out the back door and picking the most beautiful yellow flowers I had ever seen. I wrapped them in that damp towel just like my dad had done, and I proudly walked them back inside and handed them to my mother, who smiled, and she took those yellow flowers, put them in a jar, and set them on the windowsill. I'd done a pretty good thing. At least I thought I had. A few hours later, a neighbor came over and asked my mom why we had weeds in the windowsill. Weeds? Those are flowers. I remember thinking, that is how I first learned of dandelions. I picked my mother a bouquet of the most beautiful yellow flowers, only to now know I'd picked her a bunch of weeds. I'm fairly certain when Hagar looked at her son, she didn't see someone whose fate was to be banished to a desert and die of thirst. In her cries, she felt alone, scared. Hagar and her son Ishmael two beautiful creations of God, unaware of God's plan, left to thirst, seemingly to death, choked like weeds. Today, I cannot look at a dandelion without thinking about a town meeting in Brewster, Massachusetts that Brian drugged me to. There were hours of banter. There was a moderator, there was a timer, and there was a bingo machine. And absolutely what at times could be called an angry mob. My introverted soul was absolutely crushed, but my duty as a citizen fulfilled. We knew going into that town meeting that it was going to be a long one. There were over 40 items on the docket, and some were way more controversial than others. The moderator explained he was going to use that bingo machine to call out numbers from the docket, and the random nature of those numbers was going to allow us to get out of that meeting within 3 hours. 2 hours later, this man with perfectly coiffed hair was now all astray. His orchid lapel ornament wilted from all the hot air in the room. And we were on item 3. Finally, that bingo machine worked in our favor. A docket number that could feign no critique. Cutting the lawn on the town green. There was a call to vote, open discussion happened, and a man stood up. His gripe, dandelions. I am convinced that people 3 rows ahead of me heard me sigh. I know the people behind me saw my head go back and my eyes roll in the back of my head. I mean, good grief. This person went on to explain, or lament rather, about how Brewster was no better than Disney. We had ripped out all of the town's natural beauty, even the dandelions. And although his story didn't win mine or anyone else in town's vote that night, I admired his conviction. He stood alone, fueled by a mission. I was raised being told that the love my parents had for me was unconditional. They would be behind me no matter what. This gave me confidence and strength to grow and to seek out interests, to pursue life. I imagine Hagar, Abraham's maidservant, and their son, Ishmael, felt somewhat the same. Confident in their circumstance. Despite enslavement, they were serving God's will. Faith is an interesting thing. Its trials are rarely announced. But often, when they come, you find yourself alone in your own conviction, guided by a whisper. I was 20 and just back from surgery and on some great pain meds. I decided in my drugged state that I was going to write a letter. And midway through that letter, I passed out. They were some good pain meds. My mother walked in, grabbed this half-written letter, and being my mother, read it. What she read changed the world we knew instantly. The letter was to my boyfriend, someone she only knew as my roommate, and had, on more than one occasion, told me not someone she was particularly fond of. That is my coming out story, a drug-induced letter. A letter that put the words unconditional love to an immediate test. A test that at the time I felt she failed. Suddenly there were conditions. I was alone with a choice. Stand alone in my truth, or give in to the logic and the fear of everything around me. Suddenly there were conditions to my life, how things would happen moving forward. And oh yes, therapy. Lots of therapy. I was being told I needed to be fixed. I was wrong. I, like Hagar, could become a distraction. For the first time in my life, I stood against an opposition and I had no defense, with one exception: my faith. My faith in what I knew to be right. My faith in my own God-given unconditional strength. A small light inside me that wouldn't blow out. My whisper. I went to therapy, and I was told I needed to be patient. 20 years of dreams were just changed with the words of a single letter. Give your parents time. You both need to live with this truth. "33 years later, I know that that love was in fact unconditional. My parents have a son-in-law that they adore and a grandson whose very mention makes them smile. They also have this great new pool in their backyard we can go to whenever we want, and it's surrounded by this beautiful green grass, and as of last week, covered in pesky old dandelions. You know that Brewster? He was warning us against something 20 years ago that we only know as fact today. eradicate those weeds on the lawns, we're going to have a negative effect on the vernal ponds located throughout our town. Those ponds are the spawning ground for very small microorganisms that bring forth life to our planet. He stood alone in a crowd. He was called weird. He was mocked, at least by me. You see, one man's dandelion could be another man's coming out story. Or perhaps the biggest lesson a son could give his parents. Abraham and Hagar's son would grow to become a master with a bow, and he would lead his own nation. All stories of unconditional love with God's help. With God and his whisper. Are you ever truly alone? Amen.